if we keep things functional, focused on natural movements that our body needs for daily living, that our exercise becomes more meaningful. You're not going to the gym and sitting on a hip abductor machine and just working one muscle group. Maybe that, I'm not saying that that's a bad machine or a bad exercise, but it's not functional. There's nothing in your life that's going to translate to an improvement in function by doing it. So if we are mindful about what in our life potentially presents a functional challenge to us, and then we design our exercise in a way that contributes to improvement in that functional strength for that activity, it just brings a lot more meaning to what we do. And that makes it more fun. It makes it more easy for us to stick to our plan. So the first component is that our movements are functional. The second component is that we vary what we're doing. So going to the gym, or obviously nobody's going to the gym right now, but in your living room, doing the same thing over and over, day after day after day, will potentially help you maintain where you currently are fitness-wise, but it's not going to translate to a significant improvement in your level of fitness. So what do we do about that? We seek to vary what we are doing. That means some days I only work out for 8 minutes, and some days I might do it for 20, and some days I might do it for 40. Sometimes I might have, these couple exercises mixed together, and another day I'll have some different exercises. I'm pulling from different sources for what I'm doing. And people who are very active in one sport are not necessarily the fittest of humans, because they're really good, potentially, theoretically, they're really good at one thing. They, like a distance runner is really good at running. In a sense, they are fit, but if they went to lift a load off the floor, are they at risk for injuring themselves because they do not train that functional movement? I would argue yes. So the fittest of people are people who train a variety of activities and a variety of movements. This is why for our younger sports age population that we don't want kids focusing on only one sport and playing it all year long, because they will become more fit and they will develop a protective mechanism against injury if they are trained in a diverse way. So that is hard to do, because sometimes you say, well, I only know one thing to do and I don't really know how to vary it. And sometimes it takes practice, it takes skill to be able to understand how to put things together in different ways. And that's what fitness professionals are for, is to help you come up with ways to do that in a way that will be effective for you individually, right? So varying what we are doing in terms of what the activity is, in terms of the duration, in terms of the intensity, in terms of the time. The more variance we have, the better, because it's going to disrupt our system. It's not going to let us stay stagnant in our progress. Last thing that I believe is important for our fitness is to, in terms of increasing our fitness, is to increase or maintain a component of intensity. So high intensity, when we speak of intensity, is relative to each individual. So if I'm talking about a very sedentary individual, the amount of work that's going to be required to elevate that person's heart rate or rate of perceived exertion, which I'm going to explain what those things mean, is going to be less. I might have them get up from their chair 5 times in a row, and they might feel extremely fatigued from that. And but that is potentially good if they're healthy enough for exercise, right? Because I have helped them to elevate their heart rate to an optimal level to make some progress, both cardiovascularly and potentially strength-wise. So if we don't want to, we want to operate in a certain amount of intensity to make that optimal progress. And that is going to be at about 50 to 70% of our heart rate, max heart rate. So how do we calculate max heart rate? We essentially take the number 220 and we subtract our age. So in my case, I'm 37. I'm going to take 220 minus 37, and my max heart rate is going to be 183. So I don't want to be operating at my max. I want to be operating at a percentage of my max to make my progress. So if I calculate 50% of my max, that is 91 beats per minute for my heart rate, and 70% would be about 128 beats per minute. So that's kind of my range. And a lot of us have, fancy iPhones and things now that can track these things for us. You can also simply take your heart rate right on your wrist there too. So sometimes the monitors on equipment at the gym aren't necessarily very accurate. Something that's attached to your body or just taking it manually is usually a little bit more reliable. If that's not an option, you can also think about rate of perceived exertion. So we call that RPE, and that is basically how hard do you feel that you are working on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being hardly at all, 10 being you're working at your max capacity, right? So if we're thinking that we want about 50 to 70% of our heart rate max, we would be on that scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how exerted do we feel. We would be at that 5 to 7 out of 10 range of how exerted do we feel with this specific exercise, this specific movement, or whatever activity that we're doing, right? If I choose to go for a hike at the dog park with my dog and I take a really easy, leisurely stroll and I'm not moving too quick, maybe that's like a 2 for me. But if I run part of the trails or I make a point to walking quickly, maybe I increase that intensity to 6 or a 7 out of 10. That means that I elevated my heart rate, and that is going to result in more change than if I would have just gone on a leisurely walk. It's not to say that we don't need to be going on leisurely walks. It's to say that if we're varying things, some days I might go on a leisurely walk with my dog, and some days I might mix in some, faster paced walking or running with my exercise, so that I can target that heart rate so that I have more benefit from my activity that I'm doing. And please, if you have questions, I'm going to give, there's a lot of people on the call, so I'm not stopping for specific questions, but certainly if write some questions down if they come up throughout this, and I will, I can try to address some at the end, or you can certainly email me afterwards. All right, great. So the 3 things we discussed in terms of necessary components to a good fitness regimen is that your movements are functional, that you're varying what you're doing, and that we seek to have some element of intensity. So I'm going to give one other example of the intensity piece is the person who goes to the gym religiously for an hour every day, kind of walks around, like does things. They're not just walking around, they do things, but they don't ever feel like they're making progress. They're just kind of stuck, stagnant. They're kind of maintaining, but they're not making progress. And progress is defined as whatever your specific goals are. Some people's goals are to lose weight. Some people's goals are to get stronger. Some people's goals are to have less back pain. So whatever your specific goals are, we're talking about feeling like you're kind of stagnant and not moving on a path towards meeting your goals. So in that instance, that exercise program is likely lacking some intensity. So if we would take those same exercises that we were spreading out over the full hour and maybe got rid of a few of them and condensed down and worked on trying to work a little bit harder with what we have during a shorter amount of time, you are going to get more work done in a shorter amount of time, and that will increase the intensity. So just so we're clear, when we're talking about intensity, intensity is measured by power, and power is how much load you can move over a certain distance quickly. So there's three components of power. It's force, so how much load, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 25 pounds, whatever the load is, it's the force. The distance, how far you're moving that. Are you moving it from the floor? Or if you're moving it from an elevated height and not from the floor, it's a shorter distance. You're not doing as much work, right? It's harder to lift something from the floor than it is to lift something from knee height. And then time. So you've got force, you've got distance, and you've got time. Those are used to calculate power. So force times distance is your work, and then you divide that by time. That equals the amount of power that you exert with that movement. And to me, the word power or powerful is really meaningful. It's like, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to me? When I think of the word powerful, I think of armor. I think of somebody that has, protective armor, protective gear on potentially. I think of somebody who is resilient, who is able to withstand the stresses of life, the stresses of physical strain or activity or repetition. So when I think of a powerful person, I think of somebody who is protected by physical strength. I think of someone who can withstand these stresses, which we call resiliency. And I think of that person as just being well and being protected. So your physical strength is part of your armor that protects you against chronic disease, pain, and injury, which is huge, huge. So many people in our world suffer with diseases, different physical ailments, chronic disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, cancer, COVID-19, all of it. There are diseases that we are dealing with, and the weaker that we are physically, and mentally, socially, emotionally as well. Those are all components, but I'm specifically talking about physically. The weaker we are physically, the more susceptible we are to injury, pain, potentially worse effects from chronic disease. So if I have a choice in my life to build myself a little bit more armor to protect as a protective mechanism against some of these things, you better believe I'm going to do it. And I'm going to help as many people in my community that I can to achieve the same thing. That is what is of utmost importance to me in my practice, is to help as many people as I can achieve a level of strength that they did not know was possible. Because I believe it is a protective mechanism against injury, against pain, against chronic disease. So back to our three essentials of our fitness is going to be functional, it's varied, and we're mixing in intensity. And we understand what intensity is because it has to do with power and has to do with the amount of work that we do. So we can also increase intensity by increasing the load. So increasing the force would increase the power, right? So lifting something that's heavier is going to result in a more power production than lifting something that was light as a feather. We talked about distance. So increasing the amount of distance is also going to make you more powerful if you're moving the load against more distance or resistance. And then the time, if the time is less, if you're doing it quickly, that also results in increased power. So with that all being said, how can we maintain functional movements of the body? How can maintaining these functional movements of the body decrease our pain experience? Because I definitely want to touch on this because so many people do experience some degree of chronic pain, whether it's cyclical back pain that kind of comes and goes, neck pain, headaches, whatever it is. How can maintaining the ability to move in functional ways decrease your experience of pain? And the answer is quite simple. Motion is lotion. If we chronically limit the ranges of motion that our body and our joints were intended to move in, we will gradually lose mobility and lose motion at those joints. So if I never allow myself to move my knees past 90 degrees, I never go into a deep squat position, gradually those knees are going to tighten up. You're going to lose mobility. You're going to lose range of motion at that joint. And there's going to eventually be a pain response, most likely, not necessarily, but most likely. When we move, conversely, if I have pain in my elbow and I move it, I am pumping good fluid to my joint, which helps hydrate the joint, which helps dispel the inflammatory cycle that is going on in my joint. And it acts as a natural analgesic or pain reducer. Okay, so this is why people who have arthritic type pain feel worse in the morning, because they've not been moving all night. And then once they start to move and their machine gets oiled by that natural process of hydration, of fluid hydrating their joints and their synovial fluid in the joint, they start to feel better. They start to loosen up. They're not as stiff, and they have less pain. So a body in motion will stay in motion. A body that is sedentary will likely not stay in motion, right? So if we find ourselves going down a path of less activity, of limiting ourselves in terms of what we are allow ourselves to do functionally, that path will continue that way, most likely, unless you decide to do something else and change that course of action. So it's really kind of confusing, because you say, well, I have knee pain, so I can't squat low, or I have back pain, or this or that. And that may be true. And there are certain conditions where we might, a physical therapist like myself might choose to limit our patient temporarily in a certain type of movement. But more often than not, there are ways that we can help our patients and our clients find ways that they can move with less pain. A perfect example is the squat. So if I have somebody who has pain with squatting, there are umpteen million ways I can modify that movement to enable them to still squat without pain, instead of putting a blanket restriction on them and say, well, just don't squat, just don't do X, don't do this. If I have a biker who is very passionate about road biking and has pain with road biking, is it my job to tell him not to road bike? Hopefully not. Hopefully it would never get to that point. My job is to find a way that I can help him either maybe modify the position of his bike seat, modify his handlebars, potentially supplement with some strengthening to whatever area to become stronger, so that he can withstand the duration of his bike trips better. That is my job, and that is what somebody like me can do for other people. is to help find ways that we can move with less pain so that you can do the things you love. So I hope all of that makes some level of sense to you. What we're gonna do now is go through some of those functional movements that we just discussed, and I'm going to show you the points of performance, so to speak. So like what I would look for in somebody's squat, or what I would look for in somebody being able to lift something off the floor, or pressing something overhead. What do those things look like? And then if you feel so inclined, you can stand up and join me and do these things as I'm talking you through them. And then we will kind of wrap things up a little bit at the end, and that'll be it. So the first thing we're gonna do is gonna be a squat. So I am just gonna move my computer away a little bit so I have more room. And hopefully you can see me still. So when I have somebody squat, we're looking for the knees to track over the toes. We are looking for the body to stay relatively upright. Your feet are flat on the floor, and your knees drop below parallel. Sometimes people can't necessarily get that low, and that's fine. It doesn't mean you can't squat. It means right now in your current circumstance, you might need to modify depth a little bit, and that is fine. So sometimes I will have people will modify the depth to maybe a chair or a box, not a stool on wheels. This is a terrible example. Don't use a stool on wheels. But you're going to try to squat to your target. And if that feels easy, then you can make your target a little lower. But what having a target will do for you is it'll help you shift your weight back so that you get out of the pattern of kind of folding forward, and you're shifted your weight back and you're sitting back. That takes a lot of pressure off the front of the knees, and it is a better way to squat. If I am able to squat without pain, and I'm looking to improve my level of fitness, maybe I'll do some different types of squat variations with a load. This would be a goblet squat variation with a load. And the load is always very close to my body, because here is going to increase strain on my upper back that we don't really need right now. So we're just goblet squat. And there's many other variations we can look at in the fitness world. There's front squats, there's back squats, there's overhead squats, lots of things. All of these movements come back to the functional movement that is squatting. So the next movement that we're going to do is lifting something from the floor. So in its simplest term, it is essentially taking something from the floor to hip height. So the basic of that movement is a hip hinge. So if you're doing this along with me, you can grab, I have a PVC pipe, it's very light. You can grab a broom, you can grab any kind of stick that you might have, and we're gonna throw that hanger back. So I have one hand is, sorry, getting a good camera angle here. So I have the stick touching my head, I have the stick touching my mid back, and I have the stick touching my low back. And I am going to hinge forward. So I'm getting a separate motion I'm dissociating the motion at my low back from my hip. So I want to be bending from the hip, keeping my low back nice and flat. So if I bend my low back, watch what happens to my stick. It comes up off my low back. And that's not what we want. So in order to properly lift something, we are hinging and keeping that back nice and flat. What that does is it protects our back against injury but it also helps us to strengthen our low back in a functional way, which is really helpful for low back pain. So if I were to do this with a weight, I'm going to keep that same hip hinge. I can have slight bend to my knees, but the primary motion is not a squat. So I'm going to bend from the hip. My lats are engaged, so my shoulders are back, and I'm going to stand tall. And if this is not possible, this motion can be modified by changing one of the components. So I can change the load, right? I can make it a lighter load. I can change the distance. Maybe I could take it from an elevated surface, like my stool. So I'm not going down as far. I've modified the amount of distance that I'm doing. So the work that I'm doing and the power that I'm producing is going to be less. But that might be where we need to start for somebody. And that is completely fine. So the basic is the hip hinge, practicing that with a stick. And then moving on to a lighter load from an elevated surface. Progressing then to a lower surface and potentially heavier load as we're trying to increase our work and our power production. Awesome. So the next one we're going to do is going to be the push-up. So a regular push-up, we are here, our body is nice and flat. Yeah, just making sure you can see me in the camera. And our chest comes all the way to the floor, and then we come all the way back up. And if this is too hard and you cannot do a push-up, then a logical progression would be to do it from your knees, or potentially to do it to an elevated surface, like a step. So push up to a step. Or if that is still too challenging, we can do it to the wall. And the further we take ourselves away from the wall, the harder it will be. So that is our pushing motion. Our press is if we take our pipe and we press it overhead. So this is a functional movement because if we have to reach to put something in the cupboard, we are essentially doing a pressing motion. So this is a functional movement. We can do that with dumbbells. We can do it with our stick. If we do not have the motion available at our shoulder joint to accomplish this motion straight overhead, then maybe we backtrack and start to address the mobility issues that are preventing us from putting our arm over our head, right? So there's lots of ways that we can scale this down. And lastly, I'm gonna show you how to combine two of these functional movements into an exercise that really works well to get the heart rate up and add a little bit more intensity. So I'm going to squat. I'm going to bring this here right in front of me with my elbows high. This is called a front rack position. I'm going to squat down and I am going to press overhead. So I'm combining my squat with my press, combining my squat with my press. So that, again, can be done from a chair. It can be done from a box. It can be done to your coffee table. And what you are doing is by combining those two functional movements, it is going to serve to elevate the heart rate, work more muscle groups in one foul swoop. And it's going to enable you to essentially to produce more power, more work in a shorter amount of time, okay? So combining functional, there's lots of different ways to combine functional movements, and that is just one. And there's nothing better than to be able to understand some of these things and essentially be able to get more benefit in a shorter amount of time than maybe if you don't have that intensity piece and you're kind of wallowing through some random kind of non-functional type exercises. So I hope that all made sense to everybody. If there's any other exercises that you would like to see modifications for, I'd be happy to show them. And as always, if you enjoyed this today, I'd love to hear your feedback, and you can reach me at my email address is Kristen, Kristen, .carlin@gmail.com. We also have a website, it's www.evokephysio.com. You can reach me through my website. I also have a Facebook page and Instagram account if you would like to reach me through there. And I have another PT who works with me. Her name's Dr. Marcy Sparks, and she will likely come on and do another webinar here maybe in a few weeks. So we'll look forward to introducing you to her then. And next week, again, is going to be Wendy Long, who is a Reiki master and Qigong practitioner, talking about combining Qigong and yoga to create a calming practice. So we are so glad that you joined us today. And if you need anything or have any questions, feel free to reach out on any of the platforms that I mentioned above. And I hope to see you again.